Who took away the part so essential to the whole, left you a hollow body, skin and bone? Tracy Chapman.
Bending, Not Breaking, Season 4, Episode 4, The Voice in the Night. And we're back with another episode of Bending, Not Breaking. I'm Sunshine Mayfield.
This is Ben Pruitt.
And as always, Max is there twisting those dials, making us sound all silky smooth. And we are talking about some more Korra. We're still in book 1 of Korra.
That's right. I love Korra.
It's so, there's so much in this episode, that we actually needed to bring in a special guest.
Yeah, we can't handle it by ourselves.
Not at all. I can only do so much. And we have quite the guest here today with us. Today we have not a singer-songwriter, an artist, a content creator, and TikTok star who analyzes everything Avatar, and Legend of Korra superfan, Brenna Lynn. What's up?
Woohoo!
Thank you. Hello.
We are so excited to have you on this show today, and we know that you've got a massive Avatar background, and you've really just started diving into Legend of Korra, it feels like recently, based on the content on TikTok. But can you tell us kind of like how has Avatar and Legend of Korra played a role in your life, and why'd you start watching it, and kind of your Avatar Legend of Korra story?
Oh, I'd love to tell you about it. So I actually originally started watching Avatar: The Last Airbender when it came out, when it aired on Nickelodeon. So I actually very clearly remember the day that I first saw the two premiere episodes, because they played 2 in a row. And in my little 10-year-old mind, when it first premiered and I saw 2 episodes in a row, I thought it was just going to keep on going. And I was like, what? I have to wait? And that was probably the first time. That was probably the first time in my life that I was like, okay, I have to wait for this show that I like. And I would every Friday, I would watch the show as it came out. And my siblings and I would all watch it together, and we'd talk about it, and we just totally fell in love with it. And it meant so much to me as a kid, on so many different levels. And then, and that was back when it was not cool to watch it. Nobody knew about it. And then I just have rewatched it so many times throughout my life. And every time I watch it, I get something new out of it. It's such a good, full, complete show that's got so many layers and so much depth. And I've just rewatched it a million times. I ended up buying it. Everybody I can convince to watch it, I would. And then just recently, I started making TikTok content about it. So basically, I was on TikTok already. I've been on the internet for a while, making music and just talking about mental health and emotion and emotional health and music and art on YouTube mostly, but I also was doing it a little bit on TikTok. And I was actually talking to my little cousin about something, and she said something that made me ask her, oh, do you watch Avatar? Have you heard of Avatar? You're my little cousin. And she's like, yeah, it's this new show on Netflix. Have you seen it? And I was like, no, it's not a new show. I was like, no, it's an old show. And, we ended up talking about it a lot. And, it's just amazing that people in completely different walks of life can talk about how great it was. So when I found out it was back on Netflix, I started making content surrounding it to sort of share information about it. Because when I watched the show as it came out on Nickelodeon, they had all these fun in between the scenes, behind the scenes things that my cousins didn't know about since they were new to it. So it was really fun to share it with them. And so I started sharing it with the rest of the internet. And before I knew it, I was just breaking down everything from different trauma that the characters were experiencing to the different fighting styles of the different characters, and everything, the science behind what I think might be how bending works, as well as just lots of other people's thoughts and just sort of pushing other content that I thought was cool. I have also watched Legend of Korra when it came out, but I rewatched it, and now I'm actually rewatching it for a third time. And so it just, same thing. There's so many different layers of it, and it's nice to get something new out of it each time.
I am kind of blown away by that intro because there are so many things where I was like, ooh, that's kind of how we feel. Ooh, that's what we say. Oh my God, we think that too. And so like this is like meant to be, I think. Like
Yeah,
this
like, did
is
we just
going to be a
become
really
best
cool
friends?
conversation. Yeah, I think it's time that we become best friends. Welcome to the family. You can move in whenever you like.
That's right. This house is a very inclusive one, and we love bringing new people into this podcast. So one of the things that I think even just me going through Korra the first time, and I would call myself a full blown adult, maybe not in maturity, but in age. When I started watching this show,
I can vouch for that.
And I think for me, just in probably the 4 or 5 years between the first time I saw Korra and now, so much more and so different in the way that I viewed it the first time around. And so I'm just very excited to get to dive into all this.
Well, I think the commentary of Korra is becoming more and more and more prevalent and more poignant. It's becoming more real every day. And so I think Korra is very special in how it is attacking really important subjects, like what we'll be talking about today.
Which is what, Ben? What are we talking about today?
Well, we're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about episode 4 of Korra, duh.
Yes, correct.
But we watched this episode. Well, Brenna, you picked the lens here. And so you kind of gave us this idea of emotional restriction as a lens to kind of watch this episode through. So when you were thinking of that lens, Brenna, what was going through your mind? Why did you want to talk about emotional restriction?
That's a great question. So emotional restriction, I guess, is something that has always sort of it's always been something that I've thought about because I'm really good with emotions. And by that, I mean I'm extremely emotional. And I've sort of forced myself to figure out how to process them. And I'm really blessed to have like really strong support systems to help me figure out how to process my emotions, and in particular, my mom. But also, I have always been a songwriter. I've written songs from the time I was little. And I remember when I was little, you know, people would say, like, I'd sing a sad song and they'd be like, oh, you wrote that song and it made you feel better. You know, and my little, like, 13-year-old self was like, yeah, sure. But when I, like, thought about it, I'm like, that's not true. Writing the song didn't make me feel better. It didn't make the emotion go away. But what it did do is it was the only way I could really analyze, break down, process, deconstruct my emotions so that I could be okay, right? Like, it didn't make anything better, but it made it not so big and looming and scary, right? It made it something that had a name and a face. It made it something that I could move through.
Yeah.
So
you and I had a very different like childhood. And so I was emotionally repressed as a child. So like emotional restriction was kind of my thing. And hearing that from you is I think ultimately that is what led me to music. Music was the first place where, and I say place intentionally, it was like it felt like a place I could go to. Music was the first place where I felt like I wasn't restricting my emotions. I could be fully myself without having to kind of hold on to that. And so that's really interesting that you kind of accessed that feeling through music. So that's just a neat little, I find that interesting.
I so agree. I always tell people music is what emotions sound like. Like, really, how do you describe an emotion? Like, it's really hard to describe an emotion. You have to feel it. Yet music can bring these emotions in, and we can say that sounds like it's sad, or that sounds like it's excited, right? Like, I mean, that's probably true for all art, but I think especially music, because it literally is vibrations, right? It literally is this sort of, I don't know, it's magic, and it's emotion. It's what emotions sound like.
Well, and I love this thing that you talked about earlier, this idea of the emotion doesn't necessarily go away. Like, this emotion isn't like these actions of processing emotions is not, the purpose is to not be like, and you don't feel anymore. It's this idea of rumbling with it and identifying it and understanding why it's there and what it means and how we navigate that in the future. It's not this idea of like, and I was angry, and now, like, because I did this one thing, I will never feel anger again. Because that's not necessarily the purpose of processing emotion.
That's not how that works.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting because when we look at the definition of restriction, I don't love it in regards to when we talk about emotions, because it talks about the limitation or control of something. And I don't like the idea of, like, when we restrict emotions, that's us controlling them. I think, like, this idea of how we navigate this Emotions are neutral, and the way that we approach them and process them allows that our future behaviors or actions then get to kind of fall into the realm that we want them to fall and to be productive. But this idea of like, when you restrict your emotion, you're controlling it, like you're repressing it, and that's not necessarily what we want to do to live into the world the way that is most productive or the way that we want to live into it.
Yeah, and honestly, that I don't like that definition for restriction in general. I mean, think about like when people diet and do calorie restriction. Like, I don't say that's exactly control. It's more like a deprivation.
Yeah, just restriction is a generally a worrisome, problematic conversation. No matter what we're talking about restricting, I feel like, whether it's body shaming and diet culture, whether it's emotional restriction, whether it's restricting ourselves from purely based off like religious reasons to restrict ourselves. There's a lot of reasons to restrict, but most of the time I feel like, why are we restricting ourselves? Who
it's
is it
very
benefiting?
unnatural. Exactly. I think it's very unnatural sounding.
Yeah, I like that concept.
Well, before we jump into how all of this plays into the episode, me being the responsible, productive,
Keep going.
I'm thinking of accountable
Yeah,
co-host
sure,
of this
sure.
show. I'm going to take responsibility and accountability for what I'm supposed to be doing.
You tell yourself that.
Which is the 30-second recap that I don't love doing.
I love that you're doing it.
Yep. It's my turn this episode. I can admit to that.
It is your turn.
All right. So put 30 seconds on the clock, Ben, if you will.
Let me do that.
And you tell me when to go, and I'll go.
Okay. Are you ready?
I think so.
Are you sure?
No, but we'll give it a shot anyways.
Go.
Korra dreams of losing her bending, and then we see the city council arguing about how to tackle Amon, and then Amon takes over the airwaves and scares Korra. Mako falls for Asami, literally and in this emotional sense. Asami offers Mako a dinner date. Tarlok interrupts dinner at the air temple and tries to get Korra to join a task force. She turns it down. Mako goes to dinner, gets dolled up. That's fun for him. Lynn comes to visit Korra,
5
reveals
seconds.
that she hasn't been to practice, and then the things happen. More things happen. Yeah.
More things happen.
I'm taking a real Max Gongaware approach to doing recaps, which is really just starting them and then being like, and then the episode takes place.
No, a real Max approach would be like, one day,
Korra
this
was a
happened.
girl on a mission.
And that's it. And that's the recap.
All right, so I didn't get through all of it. I'll give myself a C+.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk. Brenna, we'll start with you. The first moment of emotional restriction, where does that show up in this episode for you?
Ooh, okay. Honestly, it happens in the first 20 seconds. It happens almost immediately,
I love it.
right? So the first thing that happens, she wakes up from that dream, right, where she's losing her bending, where Amon's taking her bending from her, which is like Korra's worst nightmare because her identity is very much attached to her bending and her abilities and her power. And so it's extremely terrifying for her. And she wakes up, and the first thing she does is kind of like snuggle up with Naga and say, it was just a dream. Which I think is interesting. I always hate it when I have a bad dream and somebody's like, it was just a dream. And you're like, well, it was like all these terrible fears of mine, like culminating in a movie
so
in mine.
minimalizing.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's like, yeah, it was a dream. It wasn't real. It didn't happen to her, but it still was like a moment of intense fear that she kind of her immediate response was to just stifle, right? And restrict, and numb and say it's not important.
Can I challenge that language? And so, like, I think the way you phrased that was that you're right. It didn't happen to her, but in a way, it did happen to her. Just because it happened inside of her head does not mean that it didn't happen to her, right? And I think that oftentimes the literal happening versus something that happens inside our heads is often because that is invisible, often because people don't see it and we can hardly communicate it well. It's easy to minimize.
Because the body's still having physiological responses as if they're in that
exactly
moment, right?
And so the body is like still had a traumatic response to that dream, and it's like that's what that dream is. It's a traumatic response. And so when we experience things that hurt us, and we experience these flashbacks, these things that prevent us from being able to sleep, these things are happening to us, right? And so I think that the phrase like it was just a dream is exactly right. It is restricting the emotions, and I'm not going to let myself feel this because I'm stronger than this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this idea of minimizing, and I think you hit the nail on it. When someone tells you it's just a dream or that it's no big deal, like nothing grinds my gears more than this
Yeah.
idea of like what you're feeling, you shouldn't feel it, right? Like that's just such a tough thing to hear, and it's a very unempathetic response that we should challenge when people say those things.
Yeah, especially because
for sure.
it's also oftentimes obvious. Like when somebody's telling you a dream after like midday and they're telling you about the dream they had, and it's like it's just a dream. It's like, yeah, I know it was just a dream. And it's kind of like with your feelings sometimes too. Like sometimes you know that it's not, I guess like concretely happening in front of you right now, but these emotions are real, even if they don't seem justified or they don't seem like they have, I guess, enough like concrete within right in front of you feelings.
Yeah, it really makes me think about like what came up while you were talking was this. It's the same way we kind of address phobias, like weird phobias. Like it's just a spider that can't really hurt you. It can't even bite you. It's too small. It doesn't mean I'm not scared of the spider. Like it's like,
Oh, yeah.
or whatever it may be. Like the people there are so many phobias. There's phobias of everything, but like people who are scared to go outside. People literally cannot understand why you would be scared to go outside, but to this person, that's their world, right? And so we have to learn to, why do we feel the need to restrict that phobia? Why do we feel the need to do that? And so I guess I have that question. Like, why is me responding, it was just a dream? Why do I respond that way? And I think that's what I'm lifting up and questioning.
Yeah. It just made me think of this time when I had a friend that was telling me that his girlfriend was upset with him because she had told him she had a dream where he cheated on her. And he said, he responded with it was just a dream. And then she was mad at him and he was like, why is she mad at me? Like, it wasn't real. It was a dream. And I was like, because, she told you this like deep fear that felt so real and this emotion. And, you told her, like, it doesn't matter. Like, and instead of saying, like, that sounds really scary, I would never do that. And sort of addressing the actual emotions and the actual fear rather than just kind of immediately saying, let's shut this down. It wasn't real for me. Therefore, it's not real at all.
Well, and that's the same idea of not only when we feel invalidated when someone has that response to us, but then we also choose to do that to ourselves, I feel, because of this societal response that we fear or that we're going to receive if we decide to, hey, I know this is just a dream, but it made me feel this way, and I'm trying to process this out loud. Mm-hmm. We're told, like, no, don't do those things. Like, no, like you. One, it was fake, so you shouldn't have feelings about that anyways. And then two, like, I don't want to hear about your feelings on a societal level. And the reality is we see this in this moment. This is the ball getting, like, this is the snowball turning into the avalanche for her throughout the course of the episode. Mm-hmm. It's where it starts to pick up momentum, and we start to see the trickles of this throughout the rest of the episode, this fear that expands over and over again until we see the final release of it all at the very end, which is just such a... Honestly, like 5 years ago, 2012, when this first came out, 8 years ago, because wow. But my response was not to like, I did not feel that moment. Watching it now, I felt the weight of that moment, and it hits hard.
It was an oof.
Absolutely.
Because I think Tenzin plays this right here.
I do too.
I think Tenzin plays it right where he doesn't press her, but he does give her permission to kind of say like, hey, you're allowed to process these things. You're allowed to talk about these things. You're allowed to do this stuff.
That's what I took notes on that because as we're jumping to the end. So like Tenzin like gives her the space to feel her feelings, right? And so like giving her that space to cry, giving her that space where she feels safe with him was integral to not feeling like she has to hide and restrict herself in the future, right? She's been constantly working on restricting that emotion this whole episode, trying not to feel it, trying not to feel scared, when really what gives her that final release is Tenzin. And I think his work over the past several episodes has led to this moment, but I think it's not a one-off moment. But I don't know. I think that creating that safe container, which we've talked about on the show previously, is so integral to creating an environment where people feel like they don't have to restrict those emotions, right?
Yeah, I think Tenzin, there's a couple of moments where I really appreciate Tenzin in this episode. So that obviously is one, and I definitely felt that feeling as well, that like emotional release, her gasping for air and saying, I've never felt this before and I don't know what to do and I'm scared. That's like, that hits me in the feels. But there was another moment where I was like, oh, like, good job, Tenzin. And it was actually when Tarlok comes to interrupt the airbenders' dinner, and he comes in and he talks to them and he's trying to kind of schmooze Korra, like give her all the flattery and try to talk about how great she is and how lucky Republic City is to have her. And, you know, she's like, cool, this is great. And then, you know, he asks her to join the task force. And Korra, immediately, we see her entire demeanor change. And she just like looks down and is like, no, like, I need to focus on my training, which, like, training has not stopped her from joining a pro bending team. Like, her training is important to her, but it's definitely not something that would stop her from doing something that she genuinely wanted to do. And she looks down and she kind of looks, her voice gets soft, like her entire demeanor changes. And one of the things that I love is how shocked Tenzin is. So there's like this moment where Tarlok is like, I'm shocked. And like Tenzin like whispers to himself, like, me too. And I think that really shows like this moment where Tenzin sees that change. Tenzin knows Korra more than anyone else at this point. You know, anybody at least in Republic City that knows her, right? Like the Mako and Bolin, they know Korra, but they don't know her. They haven't spent as much time with her the way Tenzin has. And Tenzin sees Korra and is like, whoa, that is not how I expected you to respond. You're not working off of your sort of core values. You're not acting like yourself. You are stifling yourself. You are you're stifling your emotions, so you're stifling yourself, and you are restricting yourself and not letting yourself be who you are and just acting completely out of character.
Yeah, and what I love about that is it leads to this pep talk that he offers her. Like he says it's okay to be scared. The important thing is to talk or we will go out of balance. And I find that moment to be really important because like one of the things I think about when I think about restricting our emotions is sometimes we think that is an act of balance. We think restricting our emotions will, like, we need to balance things out and we get back to balance, right? But what restriction does is we build up this emotion, and what happens is that fear never goes anywhere, and so it continues to tip the scale. And so what restricting it doesn't allow it to be experienced and therefore move off of the scale. And so what happens is it isn't like you will go out of balance because what you're doing is you're holding on to it and you're not letting it go. And again, as we said at the beginning, it's not something that it just goes away forever, but it ceases to be as much of a burden, of a weight, if you will. And like the data shows that when you act to restrict one emotion, the body cannot do it in a way where you're only restricting that emotion. What happens is the body restricts all your experiencing of all emotions, right? And so I see this where like it like ultimately it leads to this empty feeling. But as our sponsor of the show, Brene Brown, says, not an actual sponsor, but
but call us, Brene.
Yeah, we're happy to continue advocating your work, but you can't numb the dark without numbing the light.
And we see that in the moment where Bolin comes and shows gratitude for getting saved. We see that moment, right? So he comes up and he's just like, and she's like, it's no big deal. And he's like, what are you talking about? Like, I was terrified. So like, props to him for being able to admit that in a public place, because let's normalize that.
Yes.
But also just like he says that, but that also allows him to feel the joy of being saved. And he's like, I'm so grateful for the work that you did. She's not able to experience that love or that gratitude because she's currently working to suppress these feelings that she's having.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that's actually a really good point to bring up Bolin and sort of how he's processing everything, because they both were really scared. I mean, a big part of Bolin's identity is his bending, and he's the one whose bending was almost actually really taken away. Like, it was seconds from being taken away. And he comes in and he tells her how afraid he was. He even says, I still can't sleep through the night. Like, he is so open about these emotions, and he's really in a similar place as Korra. But the key difference is he is letting himself feel those things. He is he is processing them, and yeah, they didn't go away. He's still afraid. He still can't sleep through the night. But like you said, he can feel all these other emotions. Another good example is when he's excited about the fact that they're going to be able to afford to be in the pro bending tournament. And he's so excited about it, and all of them are excited about it. And Korra, he tells her at the party, and Korra's kind of like, "Oh, great." And it's you can see like she can't feel that happiness because she's just so numb right now. It's really interesting to kind of look at the balance between Korra and Bolin and how they're both processing a very similar emotion, but in different ways, and how it's funny because Korra is trying so hard to control her emotion, yet her emotion is controlling her. Whereas Bolin is letting the emotion flow like water or lava, if you will. And it's because he's not trying to control it, he is sort of in control. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's this interesting dichotomy.
No, it makes tons of sense. I was following along. I was
air snapping.
I was air snapping on my end. Yeah, I was like, oh my god, yeah. That is because like the idea that like if you don't choose vulnerability it's gonna invade your space. And so you can either choose to embrace the vulnerability, or vulnerability is going to control your every move, right? So if you're scared to do something, that fear is going to control you, or you can embrace the fear and lean into it, right?
Yeah,
and so
I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, even Bolin says it was a big deal. And because of that, it's not such a big deal in his life. Whereas Korra is saying it's no big deal, yet she's the one whose entire life is being consumed by it.
Exactly. And so what happens is when we, what's the difference between Bolin and Korra? Like if we ask that question, for me, and let me know if y'all have a different answer, but for me, the difference is shame. Bolin is experiencing that terror, like he was experienced the trauma and the terror of almost losing an integral piece of his identity, and he is not telling himself that it's his fault, right? It's not that he's bad. It's not that he's the worst. Whereas the inner story for Korra is, I have to hide this. No one can see me this weak. Like her story is very different, and so that to me like creates shame. And so when we have experiences of fear or trauma or pain in combination with shame, that emerges as emotional restriction, right? Because we don't want anyone to see our weaknesses. Whereas it seems as though Bolin doesn't see him expressing these things as weakness. It doesn't come across that way. And I think that's the main difference. What do y'all think?
Oh, I love that. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. You got it, Brenna. All you.
I was just going to say, I love that you use the word shame in particular, because it really, I think the whole time I watch Korra, I see so much Zuko and Korra. Like, I feel like Zuko and Korra have so many similarities. And I think that's a perfect example of just this, like, dealing with shame. I think it's one of the biggest things that she deals with throughout the entire series.
Well, and one of the things I want to kind of dive into is Korra's actions put her in, as she's trying to navigate this because of the emotional restriction, she ends up acting in ways that put her at risk because she hasn't dealt with these things, right? So as to combat or to compensate for the, am I too weak for this, I shouldn't feel these things, she then goes outwardly aggressive into challenging Amon to a duel, knowing that might not be something that might be a very dangerous situation for her. That might be something that she's not ready to handle.
Well, for me, the question is, does restriction lead us to extremes, right? And so when I restrict myself and I get, like, does it lead to the, quote, like, explosion, if you will, right? Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, right? Like, when we suppress things, and it acts differently in different people, but a lot of times when we suppress these emotions or try to hide them, at a certain point they reach a boiling point, and we explode, right? And so we do things that are outside of our character or outside of our values because of the fact that we're not processing the emotions and realizing that that's what's causing us to act outside of our values in those moments.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of The Untethered Soul, but it's a book by Michael Singer, and my mom used to quote it all the time to me, and it was really sort of, it's a very powerful book, but there's this analogy that they give about a thorn, okay? So your trauma or your fear or the things that have happened to you in your life, even if they aren't inherently terrible, but there's something that hurt you in some way. And if you have this thorn in your arm and it's piercing a nerve, then even if something just barely brushes against it, it hurts, right? So you have two options. The first option is you can say, that hurt. I'm going to cover it up with a little pad, and I'm not going to let anybody near it, and I'm going to sleep on this side, and I'm not going to play sports anymore because I don't want to hurt that thorn. I'm going to totally suppress certain parts of myself. I'm going to protect that thorn at all costs. But in reality, that people will likely bump into you, and that thorn will hurt. And it will hurt you. Even if they didn't do anything wrong, even if they were just asking an innocent question, it can still hurt you. And you might become a little bit like, you might hurt them back, or you might change who you are because that hurts. And you can live your whole life just burying that thorn deeper and not ever addressing it. And it will always hurt you every time it's brushed against. The other option is you can get in there and dig that thorn out, and it hurts and it's hard and it takes a lot more facing it, like addressing it and facing it head on. But you get that thorn out, and then you actually start to heal. And I think about that. I think about that a lot in my life because a great example of something that people often mean as a compliment to me. They'll say, oh, I'm such a good conversationalist, or, oh, I could talk to anybody. Oh, there's never a dull moment when Brenna's there. And it hurts me because I've been teased throughout a lot of my life for talking too much, or for being too loud, or being too emotional, or being too. I've always been too. And so, it's something that someone means as a genuinely kind thing, yet it hurts me. It hurts me, and I have anxiety forming about it. And that's because that's one of my thorns, right? And so and everybody has them. Everybody has hundreds of thorns, right? And they could be from serious abuse and trauma, or they could be from something small that just hurt you, but that was never really fully addressed. A great example, and my fiance would hate me for talking about him, but one time I was making fun of his hair, and it really hurt him. And it's like, what? You're like, why would this hurt you? But it had hurt him because of past things that had hurt his feelings. And it was one of his thorns that had never been addressed. And, you talked about how you have had emotional restriction in your life. There are thorns then that you learn, you put a pad over them and you protect them and you don't ever dig them out. And it could be something that then all your life you have to think about, you have to protect, and you don't have control over it because you restricted it.
Yeah, and it's not until lots and lots of therapy or lots and lots of reading to help that is like, personal therapy, whatever that groundedness comes from. For me, it was through a lot of reading and through a lot of processing. And I was like, okay, this is why I feel this way. And as soon as I'm able to acknowledge that, all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's the thorn. I didn't even realize it was this thorn before. I just saw
Korra
it.
Doesn't even know she's got a thorn right now.
Exactly, and that's my point. Is I think Korra doesn't even recognize. Is not like this. We talk about self-awareness a lot on this show, and I feel like there is that self-awareness piece isn't there yet for Korra. She doesn't even know that this is a problem, and I think that's really integral to this restrictive thing that we talk about here, because oftentimes we don't even know we're restricting ourselves, right?
Oh, yeah. We don't even know that we're burying the thorn. We don't even know we have a thorn sometimes until somebody brushes against it and we go, ooh, ow, that hurt, ow, and then we have to start addressing it. Or we make the choice to just react and never investigate.
Well, and it's so easy to just blame that person who bumped against us instead of looking at our own self and saying, oh, look, there's a thorn there. Instead, you look at them and say, that hurt, you jerk, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And we noticed that this really makes it tough for Korra to navigate the space that she's in. Like, it's tough for her to navigate her relationships when she starts to deal with this, and she's missing practice. But then we even see people start to get upset with Korra because Mako gets upset and Bolin gets upset that she's continuing to miss practice, not realizing that she is dealing with this thing right now. And so how do we give grace in those moments to understand how can we be supportive of those when they're experiencing this emotional restriction, and what's our role that we play in that? Because we see that Mako and Bolin get upset, it could have been different had they navigated a situation similar to Tenzin and creating safe spaces for her to process all of that. So as we move forward, Brenna, what are other moments in this that you want to jump on to talk about this emotional restriction that happens this episode?
I think there's an interesting moment when, like you said, you had mentioned this earlier, where Korra challenges Amon to a duel. And I thought that was a really interesting moment because I think it was her attempt to face this head on and take care of this, but she still had never admitted that she was afraid. She was trying to take on the fight rather than look into herself and, like you said, become more aware. Look into herself and face her own demons and her own fear and her own emotions. She wasn't able to look in and process and deconstruct her emotions. She was so busy trying to externally solve all the problems.
To me, it felt like she was trying to prove herself wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And prove to everyone else that she wasn't afraid.
Yeah.
And even, that brings me to another similar moment is when all the reporters are asking her at Tarlok's party, what's she going to do? Does she even care? Is she afraid? And she kind of grabs the microphone all angrily and is like, I'm not afraid of anything. And so she decides I'm going to make a show about how tough I am. And what it really is, if you really look at it, is it's a fight or flight response. It's a fight response, right? It's her going, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling unsafe. I don't even know what I'm feeling, but my gut reaction before I even process what I'm feeling is to fight. It's to fight back, which I think she also has. She has that in the form of freeze, that fight, flight, or freeze. She also freezes, where she just, throughout the entire episode, she doesn't look like herself, right? We usually see her standing confidently, hand on her hip, using her strong voice, and throughout this entire episode her voice is so soft, and she's sitting and she's looking down and looking slumped over, and you can tell she's just sort of frozen with this fear.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think that just reverting back to your thorn conversation, it seems like what happens when we restrict ourselves and then these reporters literally took their finger and pushed the thorn in harder. And they were like, I found it. And they pushed right exactly where she knew, they knew that, I guess, I assume Tarlok fed them questions. That's part of my guess. Or at least he knew that they would be asking questions like that would goad her. And I think that when we're restricting ourselves, we are less capable of responding to people prodding our thorns. Is that a
stressful situation? Right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's tough. That's a tough moment. And I think you're right. Headcanon points to me as Tarlok met with all of these reporters beforehand and was like, here are the questions that are going to really razz her berries and make sure that she just gets aggressive and gets upset and really poke those thorns. And so we see that, and then we see that become an overreaction again. It is tougher to deal with those stressful situations if we are not processing the emotions that come in ourselves before those happen.
Yeah, the whole time she's just trying to convince herself that I'm not afraid. She's trying to convince everybody, but really she's trying to convince herself. And she's just not even, she's not getting to a point where she can really break down that feeling and process her fear. I was going to say talk about her fear, but I don't think you necessarily need to talk about it to process it. It's kind of like what you were saying about, different people need to talk about their emotions. I'm somebody that I kind of need to talk or write a song in order to really deconstruct and process my emotions. But there are plenty of people who need to do something else. Maybe they need to make art. Maybe they need to just take time for themselves. Maybe they need to pray, right? There's so many different ways. It doesn't have to be talking with somebody, but it is this concept of processing, making yourself aware, deconstructing, and letting the emotion flow. So that's something that I think that she's struggling with. She's in such a position of going, I'm not going to feel. I'm not going to feel. That she never has that opportunity to break it down.
So I want to move the conversation a little bit towards Tarlok. So I have
great guy, just
I have
real upstanding guy, right?
super kind and generous. Respectful of Earth or Airbender traditions. So Tarlok's use of Yakon's story with Tenzin and the other members of the council early on in the episode to gain power. My question is his restriction of his childhood experiences with his father and his brother, is that experience and his restriction of holding on to that for his entire life and not being willing to share that he's the son of Yakone and all of that, how is that affected?
What?
Sorry, spoiler alert. How has that affected his, how has that emotional restriction affected how he is and who he is today? What do y'all think about that?
Ooh,
Yes.
man.
The answer, in short, is yes. And I think it's for very similar, like when we have this shame or when we have this experience or when we're not processing our anger or our feelings of revenge or our feelings of just contempt, like if we're not processing those, and I think you're right, Brian. I think you hit it on the head. That for some people that's meditation, for some people that's soundboarding off of other people. But if we're not working to understand why those emotions exist, it drastically affects the way that we're going to behave in the future. And I think that he is trying to navigate the world the best way that he knows how, and he has not had great role models for that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you see all of his sort of trauma and probably generational trauma as well.
Yeah, so much. I mean, we have not gotten to the episode where they've revealed all this. And I don't even think at this point in the story he realizes that Amon is
correct.
His
Yeah,
brother.
Yeah. He doesn't find out until he gets captured.
But at a certain point, the way that we're raised, the environments that we're in, have a deep effect on the way that we grow up and the people that we become. And especially if we're not processing those things and processing our childhood and asking questions and navigating why we learned certain things, and if we're not doing that work, then it makes it that much easier to then kind of find the moral ambiguity that exists for Tarlok and how he gets there. So he's dealing with a lot.
He is.
I think he's just trying to do the best with what he has.
It doesn't mean we're not going to hold him accountable.
Correct, right? Because we see a manipulation almost of the way that he uses Airbender tradition when he walks
almost.
in. You never turn down a guest as Airbenders, right? Great.
Well, and even it's like what you said about Korra, too. Like, he knew how to get to Korra.
Yeah, he knew the buttons to press. And quick tad bit, this is just a side note from earlier that I missed. I'm really impressed with Tenzin's ability to reinforce Korra's boundaries that she set at that dinner table.
Yes.
So when she says, like, I'm not doing this, and Tarlok continues to push, Tenzin is very quick to be like, she told you no.
Yes.
Like, you need to go. We're done. Like, and so just respect to being able to enforce other people's boundaries and maintain that safe space, which is just, we don't always do that. And so that's something worth highlighting. Tidbit, not tadbit. That's what I said earlier, but tidbit is what I meant.
Max and I made eyes.
Language is tough sometimes, and I mess up, but that's okay. We move forward. We accept the mistakes we've made, learn from them, and move on.
Thank you for not restricting your emotions on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, good job. Way to accept it, process it, move past it.
That's right.
Yeah. I have one more.
Agree, though. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, before we move on, you should go.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say something about, like, everything with Tenzin and Korra's dynamic throughout everything, but especially in this episode. We also see him become so concerned because of how much he's practicing airbending. So one of the things I noticed rewatching this episode, I was like, oh my gosh, we see her practicing her airbending stances like nonstop in this episode. And Tenzin picks up on, like, there is clearly something wrong with Korra. Like, his understanding of Korra, he's understanding her emotions before she's able to understand them. He's understanding that there is something wrong, even if she's not able to talk about it or admit it just yet. But also, it really makes me think about people, like, diving into their work. Like, when they're going through something difficult and they're struggling to process it, they just compartmentalize, and they'll oftentimes, like, go, and I mean, I'm totally guilty of it too. I'm talking about it as if I've never done it, but I totally have, where it's like, okay, this is very overwhelming, this is very hard, and so I'm going to do something that is totally the opposite and that I can just completely dive into. And sometimes that can be a healthy way to take a break, but you can tell that Korra's not really using it in a healthy way in this episode. Well,
and it kind of goes back to our conversation around when we numb, right? So, like, working ourselves and doing work as a way to not feel something is a type of emotional restriction. And so I feel like that's what you're pointing to, is that when you numb one way or the other, you are numbing everything, not just one thing. And diving into work, which is what I'm also guilty of, workaholic here, a recovering workaholic, I should say, is one of that's a great way to numb. Great being like, it numbs really well, not good, don't do it, but but
it
yeah,
works.
It works. I can vouch for
Yeah.
it. But yeah, I think that's really an important thing to point to. I think that's great insight. Thank you for lifting that up.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So the next thing that I want to ask is a very similar question to Tarlock, except we only get like literally 3 seconds of Lynn. But I feel like, speaking of emotional restriction, Lynn might take the cake in terms of like holding back feelings. And so, like, because we see later on in the series that, you know, she's kind of been holding on to things her entire life and not expressing them. And we see her address it later. But I just wonder, with the difference between Tarlock and Lynn, like, to me, it's clear that they're both holding on and withholding emotion and restricting themselves from expressing him. And that manifests in very different ways. And so what are y'all's thoughts on just the difference and the similarities between those two unique experiences?
I think first thing is, similarly, it both lead to what I would call unproductive behaviors, or ones that aren't the goal, right? So shutting down the way that she approaches people, like in general, is heavily impacted by the lack of processing of all the things she's feeling. We're just currently not aware of what all those things are yet at this point in the series. But you're right. We learn that there's a lot there. But isn't that like pretty indicative
For
of life?
A lot of people.
Like, right?
Yeah.
But we don't know the stories of the people that are in front of us, and so how do we act as support systems when we don't? And how do we do that differently?
Which brings us back to what is the most generous assumption that we can make, right? That's what it brings us back to. Like, okay, rather than me being like, this person's a jerk or that person's a this, or name calling and blaming, how do we bring it back to what's the most generous assumption that I can make, right? Because it helps us better engage the world. I just think that it requires so much patience. But again, if this show has taught us anything, is that people's backstories are complicated, and our jobs as people are to remember that.
Yeah,
right?
we don't know what their thorns are.
Exactly. That's exactly, yes.
Well, I think with Lynn specifically, it also plays into this idea of how does our engagement in society through the work that we do or through our employment, how does that affect emotional restriction, right? So if you're in a role or a job that you feel not only like, I'm supposed to be emotionally restricted, right? I'm not allowed to be emotional,
Yeah.
Or have emotions, or this idea of like, I'm in this position of power and I can't show my emotions, and the effect that it has long-term on psyche and on your physiological body, like your actual body, like how does that have effects long-term on that? Because we know that there's physiological responses to holding in emotions and feelings of isolation and loneliness and all of these things, and we know that has an effect on your body long-term. We know that holding these things back emotionally affects your behavior over time. And so what happens when we're jumping into roles that dictate that, right? Like, hey, you are supposed to be emotionally stunted because that's what you have to do to be successful in this job, even if that is untrue.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for that, except for if you're in a place of work, don't do that, right? Like, don't like allow for people that you work with to process emotions and let that be a norm in your organization.
Yeah.
But if you're not in a position of power in an organization, it's tough to do that.
It is. And, we work with kids for such a long time that sometimes we have staff that are experiencing big emotions. But, like, you're also responsible for 20 children, and it's our responsibility to make sure they have an incredible day. So where's the line on like making sure that like they need a place to process and you're responsible for 20 children, right? And so there it complicates things with like, and so I remember being told, this is probably not the best way to do it, but like you need to fix your face, right? Where I am feeling and experiencing a certain emotion, and I am responsible for so many kids and here's what happens. I need to fix my face and put the mask on, if you will. And that's what I was told, right?
When it's easier to do those things if we're processing the emotions at other times throughout the course of our life, right? Like,
yes.
It makes it easier for us to do that. But creating safe spaces, I think, in a work environment where people can process that away from
and I think that's the difference, right? It's saying, okay, when we're here, this is not an appropriate time to express it in this way. When you are here, I want you to express it as whatever way you need to. This is how you can do that, and here's when. But like emotions don't work that way either. It's not like, okay, I'm going to turn off this emotion now, but I'm going to come back to it later. And it's a really hard thing to navigate, and I just don't know. I'm just kind of complicating a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know if there is an answer, at least one that I can think of. It's so complicated, and it really makes me think especially of like women in the workplace, in a lot of workplaces where, I have a friend she's been told with her more male-dominated field that, never cry. Do not let yourself cry ever. She'd rather die than cry at work, and it's like this concept of you cannot show that you have an emotion, because a lot of people unfortunately see emotions as weakness, right? I think, I don't know. And I also, this is definitely not like a female only problem. I think it affects men, women, and everybody in between. Like, so many men, for example, are taught from the time they're little boys they're not allowed to show emotion anywhere, right? So
yeah.
it's really
everyone is a victim of the patriarchy.
Oh, exactly.
Exactly. It's so true, and it's different because like if I blow up, right? If I get super angry and I blow up at a team member, that can easily be portrayed as like he's just really passionate and wants us to do that well. And that I get the benefit of the doubt of that. I don't do those things. I don't do those things. But I'm just saying, as a white male in my industry, it is pretty acceptable for me to be passionate about that type of work.
AKA angry.
AKA angry, right? And it's not. That's not how we should act. But also, we don't give that benefit to other people. We condemn other people for doing those things or becoming emotional in workspaces. Even in private sectors of the workspace where it's like you're in your own office. Well, it's like, no, don't like that. Don't like the feels. So I don't think we're going to have you work here anymore. And you're right. Everyone is a victim of the patriarchy.
Yeah, and I think the workplace is kind of an interesting extra space, So it's kind of difficult. But I think that as long as we have a lot of good emotional support in other places, and a lot of times we can at least process things so that they don't become, trauma. You can be sad for a day. That doesn't mean you're depressed, right? Like if you can go home and process that and break it down, then a lot of times you can help fix it. Like I had heard before that anxiety is just a continuation of fear. Like when you look at fear itself or sadness or happiness or any emotion, they're very fleeting. They come and they go. It's when we sort of put up blocks within our body and make them sort of spiral and circulate. That's when it becomes something that affects us day in and day out. A good example is the time I fell down the stairs. So just recently I fell down the stairs. I was okay. I'm really good at falling because I do it all the time. So every time I fall, I usually am fine. Like, I don't know. My body is really good at landing because I've fallen a lot. I'm very clumsy. But anyways, I fell and it was really scary. It was really scary. And I can feel like the fear surge through my body, right? Like I had lightning going through my blood of that fear and my hands were shaking. And everybody's like, are you okay? And I'm like, I'm fine. But then like an hour later, it was out of my body, right? Like literally an hour later, I was fine. There was no fear pulsing through my body. However, I still have anxiety about that dumb thing I said like months ago, right? That like can cause a real physiological response in my body. It's like, why is it this thing that like fear is okay? I was supposed to feel fear in that moment of falling down the stairs, but I processed it. It went away. Whereas that fear that sort of gets stuck in your body and never works its way to being processed and broken down is when it kind of, you keep feeling it over and over and over again.
Yeah,
So
that really lines up. Sorry.
No, go
that
ahead.
really lines up. That lines up a lot with the research from Hilary Jacobs Hindle in her book, It's Not Always Depression. She talks about the emotional change triangle in that book. And there are 7 core emotions. You can go look it up on Google, but there are 7 core emotions that are like where we stand. And when we experience one of those, that elicits a response from us. And often that response is an inhibitory emotion like anxiety or shame or guilt, or we bypass those even, and then we're like, nah, I'm going to go straight to, nope, I feel this emotion. I don't like it because it's bad, and so I'm going to go eat something to cover it up, or I'm going to go binge Netflix so I don't have to feel this thing. And so what happens is generally we feel an emotion like anger, then we feel guilty for feeling angry, and then we're like, I don't like feeling guilty, so I'm going to go eat a banana nut muffin. And so what happens is it becomes this triangle of things that we do to just not feel something. When in reality, if we let ourselves feel it, this is the premise of the book, if we just let ourselves experience that emotion, it is much more likely rather to just go through us and then it will dissipate. But as long as we hold on to it, it will stick with us.
Well, and that so lines up with Korra, in this episode, when she finally is able to sort of let the fear in and go, wow, I was really scared. And she tells Tenzin, and she breaks down and she cries and she opens herself up and admits and becomes aware and recognizes the fear that was in her. Then
absolutely, if
you watch the next episode, the first scene is her smiling with her friends again, because now she's not totally incapacitated from the fear. It's is she still afraid of Amon? I'm sure she is, but she's not totally just replaying fear over and over and over and over again in her mind because she can't let it out. She can't process it.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a better way to end this segment. That was just like you tied a little bow on our whole conversation. That was awesome.
Really nice gift for us.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. So good. Wow, cool. This has been really cool. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a short break, and then we're gonna come back, and then Brenna will still be with us, and we're gonna talk about some devotion.
Yeah, a little bit of gratitude, because who doesn't love some gratitude?
Because we all love gratitude.
That's right. Unless we haven't processed our emotions, and then it becomes
hard.
It's tough to feel the gratitude. But we'll do that. We'll be right back. All right, and we are back. We're going to do our devotion. We're going to talk about emotional restriction. We're going to do that through the element of air. So who wants to go first? Who wants to say what their goal is moving forward for this week in regards to emotional restriction and the element of air?
Me, I'm ready. So I don't know if you knew this, Brenna, but I also sing. I was for those of you that have been listening for a hot minute, I was a music major for my undergraduate.
Cool.
Majored in vocal performance. Yeah. And one of the things that I remembered during our conversation today was how liberating it is to sing. And I think about all the moments where like I just got everything out by turning the music up in the kitchen and just started singing musicals and just let myself dance a little bit and just like opened up and sang and used the breath that is within me. And like, I think singing is just a really integral part of expressing ourselves. And I think that if I want to lift that emotional restriction, often I get bogged down by like, no, I have to do this. I'm a workaholic. I got to keep working, when just taking a few minutes to sing and get into my body and feel that embodiment and that air embodiment within me is so clutch. So I'm going to commit to this week to singing more, to singing at least once a day and really letting myself feel the feels. That's me. I win. Haha. Who's next?
I'll go next. Okay, so let's see. For me, I want to take some time to write. And I think about like airbenders being creative, like, having connection to music, having connection to art, and caring about those things, and being free in the way that they express themselves. That is something that I want to try to do. I want to take a moment to write, and I'm going to leave it very vague, because if I decide that I'm in the mood to write poetry, I'll do that. If I'm in the mood to just journal, I'll do that. But if I'm in the mood to, write music, maybe I'll do that. But I want to do something that is creative and something that can help me really sit down and process my emotions rather than restrict them.
I love that. I have a theory, Brenna. I want to hear your take on it before we listen to Sunshine. So because air and, singing are like, you need air to sing, I have a little bit of a headcanon that the airbenders had the best singers. What are your thoughts on that?
Ooh, I don't know. Let me think about it. I could definitely see that. I could see that. I could see the airbenders being good singers. I wish we got to see some of these airbenders back in their prime, I'm glad we get
That's
to
what I'm
see
saying.
I'm glad we get to see the rebuild of the spoiler alert, the air nomads kind of coming back. But I'd love to really see what their culture and life was like in more than just flashbacks.
Awesome. Love it.
Feel good about it?
I feel good.
Yeah.
Confirming my headcanon.
Although, also, Iroh's got some good singing. Like, we see him sing a few times, Man, there were those Earth Kingdom Secret Tunnel. Like, they were members of the Earth Kingdom. They were singing really well. So I don't know.
I love
there
the
could
Nomad
be
band. Yeah.
there could be a lot of. There's a lot of potential. A lot of competition.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talent out there, Ben. I think for me, in the same vein, one thing for me, and I even thought about doing it earlier today, and I didn't, and now I wish that I had, and I will do it this week, is it's just meditating to process emotions and taking time every day to sit for 10 minutes, either with a cup of coffee or just by myself or sit on the porch when I can and just think and just reflect. And I think that's something for me that really allows me to process the way that I'm feeling, and so that's what I plan on doing this week moving forward.
I love that.
So that's my goal.
Listeners, what are you doing? What are you doing this week in relation to whatever our lens is, air, and restriction? And how are you setting a goal on that? We'd love to hear about it. Send us a voicemail, thearkofe@gmail.com.
I'm so thankful that you lifted that up. Now it's also time for us to be thankful for some characters.
Gratitude.
Brenna, you go first. If you're up for it, who are you grateful for this episode?
There are so many characters to be grateful for. Part of me really wanted
Truth.
to do the obvious and be grateful for Tenzin. But I think I'm gonna give you a curveball, and I'm gonna say mine is Bolin. I just really love the vulnerability that he shows and his ability to just so quickly and comfortably talk about his feelings, and sort of prevent that forming of a thorn, right? Like, he's just like, whoa, this is scary, and I can talk about that. I'm not afraid of how people will perceive me for it. It's just a really good example, and it's the kind of person that you want to be friends with that can help you kind of grow. And I'm really thankful for Bolin for being vulnerable and for speaking about his emotions. When you think about the opposite of restriction, I think of the word flow, and I feel like he really has got a good flow going there.
His chi isn't really blocked, if you will.
Yes. Oh, snaps to that.
Thanks. I like getting snapped at. Sunshine, who are you grateful for?
I'm going Korra. I'm going with Korra this episode.
The main character.
Yeah, which I rarely do. I rarely pick the main character, but this time I think it's so important to lift her up because she finally gets to that place where she has that emotional release and starts to work through it and shares that with others. And I am so grateful that she gets to that place. And
this is such a pivotal moment for her in her whole series arcs, right? This is just a really big moment, period.
And so that's who I'm giving my gratitude to, is Korra.
I love it. All right, so I don't know about Bolin being a curveball, but I have a curveball for you because we didn't talk about her all episode. So I'm giving gratitude to Asami. One, because awesome and great. Two, because I kind of struggled wording this because I wasn't sure how I wanted to talk about it. But like, she is incredibly kind and generous, and she's generous with her money and her family's money, and she gives it away. She asks for her father's blessing to sponsor the fire ferrets, and she sends Mako a silk scarf. She's just, money is something that she's willing to give away. She's not gatekeeping that money. She's not like withholding it from anyone. She's just giving it away. And I think that that's something that I hope that if I ever am graced with the privilege of having a lot of money, that I will be able to give it away as freely as she does. And I mean, obviously, I think that I don't know what philanthropy, the Sato industry, future industries is really all about, but I do know that Asami in this episode is very giving, and I'm very grateful for it.
Love that. There's so much more to process with future industries and Sato's, like outside of this lens. That, like,
we're gonna get there eventually.
I have so many thoughts, and I can't wait to dive deeper into them on everything that revolves around the Satos, and so I can't wait.
Yeah,
we will find a lens.
That's how I feel about every episode of Korra.
It's like there's so much that I didn't talk about.
Yeah.
Brenna, Lynn, thank you so much for joining us this episode. We are at the end of the episode, but where can people find all of your things? What are the handles, and where can they find you?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. So, if you want to see all of my emotional processing in the form of song, that exists anywhere where there's music, right? So, search up Brenna Lynn on Spotify, Apple Music, or YouTube is where I update the most. So those are places where you can hear my original songs or other covers of various things. If you like me talking about Avatar, I do a lot of that on my TikTok. And sometimes occasionally on my Instagram, which is all at Brenna Talks Too Much. So, there's that. But that's where I can be found. And I love connecting with other people. So feel free to reach out to me on any of those platforms.
Love it.
Fantastic.
Love it.
For us, check us out at BNB_pod, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. Those are all places you can find us. Thearkofe@gmail.com if you want to reach out to us and send us voicemails of your thoughts on this episode or on future episodes or past episodes. That's a wonderful way to send us a 2-minute voicemail, and we'll get you right here on the show.
And remember, you can always support us and help us continue to do this via Patreon. You can find us there at BNB_pod as well. And on our Patreon, remember, we have lots and lots of cool little gifts for you if you choose to support us on different
Some bonus
tiers.
episodes that feature Max.
2 bonus episodes a month.
We're diving into the comics on Patreon, which is fun.
We're even going to be talking a little bit about the Dragon Prince on Patreon.
Which is fun because that show is good.
So good.
So good. But y'all, thank you so much for listening. I'm Sunshine.
This has been.
And we will be here next time.